Welcome to GovCom Unfiltered, where your journey through the labyrinth of federal contracting begins. I'm Alexa Choi, your guide and host on this epic adventure. Here, we dive deep into the heart of government contracting, shedding light on the heroic tales of those who navigate its complex terrain. Our mission? To bring you closer to the action, revealing the critical steps, triumphant victories, and occasional pitfalls that our intrepid adventurers face. Your journey into the world of government contracting starts now, and we could not be happier to have you with us. Let's embark on this adventure together. On today's GovCom Unfiltered, we are talking to Troy Francis. I'm very excited about this, and I'm not going to try to introduce him because his background is deep and wide and awesome. So Troy, go ahead. Welcome.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast with you. I'm happy to just speak to your audience and just share some information from my perspective. But to give you a brief background on myself, I've spent 16 years in the government working for both the federal sector and also the local sector here in the District of Columbia. I also spent 6.5 years, had my own business. I co-own 2 restaurants in the city of DC. I also own my own event planning management design company. So we did everything from luxury weddings to corporate functions and everything in between. So I've had kind of a wide range of experience all around the circle, and it's been great. My primary focus now is leading the District Department of Transportation for the city and leading our procurement team. I have a team of about 40 people that I overlook, and it's been very rewarding since I live in the city. I get to see some of the projects we work on hands-on. I get to walk down the street and see the results of those. But yeah, prior to that, to working for District Department of Transportation, I spent years at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and also at the U.S. Department of Defense. So I'm happy to share all the information and knowledge I have from those.
Wow. All I can say to that is wow. I have a lot of different places we can go, but we're going to try to focus on the questions we have.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, working in the federal space. You said that you were at HHS, you were at DOT, and then now you're in a more of a state and local role. And then you also owned your own business as well. And so what are some of the themes that run throughout all of those, and what's very, very different?
Yeah. So I would say the number one theme is that creating change is hard. And whether you're in an ownership group or like for instance, when I co-own restaurants, we had an ownership group with multiple members. Creating change and coming to a consensus is difficult. When I've worked in any agency in the government, you're part of a lot of steering committees, a lot of task forces. If you're in a chief role like myself, you're working with other executive members, and you have to come to a consensus on a lot of decisions that impact people or the service organization you have. Change is hard, and especially in the government. As most of us know, change in government tends to move slowly. And part of that is by design. Because we are spending taxpayer money, I think you would want a lot of checks and balances in place that help regulate some of those things. I think you would probably prefer to have more regulations and policies in place to make sure that someone's just not acting on a whim and completely embezzling funds or doing stuff just erratically and spending money just completely wastefully without following any procedures or protocols. So change is hard, but it's not impossible. And I've been fortunate in my career to where I've worked with a lot of great people and a lot of great teams that have given me the ability to launch a division or help launch a division from scratch, help launch initiatives from scratch, help develop teams from scratch, change an organizational structure like my current team is set up, and really just be able to have the freedom to create and see some of those changes get implemented. So that to me has been a real big benefit, both in the federal space and the local space. And, if I'm going to compare the two, I would say in the local government sector, you can implement those changes a lot quicker. You're within arm's reach of a lot more people, including private industry, including like leadership from the state level or city level or local level. Whereas when you're in the federal sector, I mean, you're really not interacting with Congress people. You're really, for the most part, you're dealing with nationwide or worldwide companies that you're really not going to meet face to face all that often, if ever. So, there's more layers of approval in a federal agency versus a state or local agency. So the ability to implement change can just move a little bit faster, and the impact, I would say, is greater. I mean, obviously your budgets aren't as gargantuan as some of the larger agencies in the federal sector. So the impact there is huge.
Perfect. Before we got started, we actually were rapping back and forth a little bit about what's been your favorite experience so far. And I thought your answer was super great. So could you share that with us? Out of all
Yeah.
of your collective experience, what have you enjoyed the most so far?
Yeah. So when I was at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, I worked for the agency called BARDA, and that stands for Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. So one of those long government acronyms. And we had a team that launched a division from scratch called Drive, the Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures. And lo and behold, maybe a year after we launched that division, the COVID pandemic came up, which no one could have anticipated. And if you go back to the early infancy stage of that pandemic, the first couple of months, I mean, it was chaotic. There were tens of thousands of deaths happening every day. We had really no protocols in place for it. We didn't really have any medical countermeasures to deal with it. PPE equipment was scarce. We just didn't have really anything to deal with it. And so part of what our agency did was invest in some of the diagnostic kits, therapeutics, and vaccines to get out to US citizens. And so being a part of a division that helped do those types of things was pretty rewarding. And I remember one of the first companies that we invested in was through a procurement vehicle that my team and myself had launched. And the company received one of the first emergency use authorization approvals for their diagnostic kit. And I remember in the early phases of COVID, the first test I ever took, I saw their name, their brand, their logo on it. And I was like, holy crap, like this is awesome to see something that we created come to fruition, investing in this company and actually their product being put out there to help save people's lives. So that was probably my favorite experience to see that firsthand for sure.
Talk about impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
wild, wild shit show, is what it
Yeah.
was in the first couple
Yeah.
months. So
Yeah.
thank you for your service there.
It's all good.
So tell me a little bit about working for DC. I think DC is one of
Mhm.
those places where people visit a lot. I do know that people live there.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm one of
but
them.
how you're one of those. I live there sometimes.
Yeah.
But what's your vibe on like working for the districts and how does it? I mean, I know you said it's DOT and you can kind of like walk around and see some of the things, the actual direct impacts of what you're doing, but how does it work from being like a leader for the district?
Yeah. So I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but the layers of approval and authority are not as robust as like a large federal agency, like some
Right.
behemoth agency that exists. So you can actually recommend change or start an initiative and you can actually see it move a little bit quicker. It doesn't have to, you know, get someone else's approval to be done. Like if there's a regulation, for instance, that I feel doesn't suit the agency well or private industry well, I'll go and do speaking engagements and let private industry know, like, here's a regulation that I think is impacting you in a negative way, and it's really hampering us as an agency to operate. I highly recommend you go and lobby for this change. And I've done this now with some of the regulations we have for the architectural engineering industry. And, I don't think I would be able to really do that in a federal sector as effectively because they can easily go to their city
Right.
council and
Hmm.
lobby and get things accomplished much faster versus someone getting on the calendar of a congressperson, getting the five
Yeah.
minutes they have to pitch something, and then it just gets like thrown in a basket somewhere. Like it just the ability to implement those types of changes and educate people is a lot easier. And it's also the budget component of it. It's a little bit different. So in the federal sector, you have sometimes 1 year money, 2 year money, 5 year money, 10 year money, no year money. Whereas at a state and local level, it is a fiscal year by fiscal year basis. So you're operating
Right.
year by year, much like a company does. And
Right.
you have to really fine tune how you're spending your money because your revenues aren't as massive and you have to control your expenses. And also in some instances, you're getting supplemental funding from a federal agency. Like we get a lot of money from Federal Highway Administration. And so they have all their compliance standards and auditing things that we need to
Right.
adhere to. But with that being said, like you have to be very cognizant of how you're spending your money at, I think, much more at the local and state level for sure.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it sounds like most things, there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons.
Yeah.
Tried to talk to a lot of folks about when they're looking for new jobs. Like, do you want to work for the government, which is a good option? Do you want to work
Mhm.
for a large business or a small business? Right? Because all of them have their
Yep.
own pros and cons kind of things.
Yep.
All right, cool. So let's talk about contractors. Everybody's favorite topic. Uh, what is it that and I always consider myself in that basket because I've always been one. What do you think contractors can do better?
I think recalibrating your expectations on what it takes to get to that first award, whether it's a subcontract, whether it's an eventual prime contract. I've heard it a million times over from contractors of how can I become a prime? Or how
Right.
do I graduate from this to a prime? Or why can't I win an award? I've submitted dozens of proposals, or why am I not hearing back from the agency? I responded to their RFI or market survey. What's going on? Like, why am I just not able to get ahead? And the reality is, again, like the government it moves a little bit slower intentionally. And it's probably not the right expectation to think that it's going to happen like that, and you're gonna just start generating this pipeline of business from one agency very quickly. Like, that's not probably a realistic expectation. Also, it may take you years as a subcontractor to actually become a prime. Like, and the best people to actually teach you or to mentor you are the primes. Like, they have the keys, to the car there. Like, they can show you what it takes, and a government agency can't. Like, we don't have the
Yeah.
answers on what that takes. Like, you have to figure out how to navigate that. And then also the expectation with getting meetings with certain individuals at an agency, or how do I get my foot in the door? How do I show them my product or technology, or match a face with a name? Now that takes really hard networking, and that is something that you can have a direct impact on. Like, I say this time and time again, if you're hearing about a solicitation when it's posted, you're so late. You're beyond late in the game, and you
Hmm.
have almost an impossible chance, most likely, of winning that solicitation. Like, even
Right.
if you're first hearing about it when an RFI or market survey comes out, you're probably too late. You should be engaging with the program managers well before that. And a lot of contractors think that the contracting officer should be able
Yep.
to provide. And I'm like, you've got to understand the program managers have the money to spend. They
Right.
have the budget to
Exactly.
spend. Contracting
Yep.
officer doesn't have the money to spend. We have the authority to
Right.
spend it and to get to. That's very different. And so trying to engage with the contracting officer is not going to be as effective versus engaging with the program managers or division directors or whoever overseeing those programs. So that's something that I think a lot of contractors should just really recalibrate their expectations. If you're going to go and try to make the government as your primary source of business, just know that it may not move as swiftly as you think it's going to.
I really like this advice because that what happens is it kind of flows down to the BD capture people, like unrealistic expectations. Oh, you have to put numbers on the board in 6 months. So that's not really realistic. You have to give a
Mhm.
BD capture person 2.5 years to really move the needle. And that's
Right.
an investment that companies just have to make. It's like the cost of doing business almost, right?
Yeah.
So, but I wanted to also go back to what you were saying is like the contracting officer is not your end customer. It's the
Right.
program office, right?
Right.
And so that's a common misnomer that people make, and I did too when I first entered, the space. I mean, did I make a lot of contracting officer friends? Yes, I did. And are they awesome? They're awesome. And end of
Yeah.
year money when they're panicking and they're like, you do want to
Yeah.
be at the top of their list. But at the end of the day, you want to have established a trusted relationship with the program office. And that's actually a lot harder to do because they're also not people that are usually out and about as much as,
Yeah.
other folks.
And also, something else that on that note, like, not all agencies are created equal. I think any contractor knows
Yes.
that. There are some
Yes.
agencies where communication is clear and crisp and easy to follow. Like, you know what's going on. Like, there's no guessing games. It's like a breeze to really work with them, versus some other agencies where maybe they're
Right.
understaffed, or like they just got people who
Right.
are unwilling to change a little bit or do things differently or seek another alternative, and it just moves at a snail pace for whatever reason. They're not all created equal, but there are
Yeah.
certainly some great ones in which those program managers, like at the agencies I worked at, like at BARDA, for instance, they were constantly going to conferences, conventions, networking with industry, meeting new people, sourcing those companies through those
Right.
methods.
Right.
We also used accelerator networks to source some of the companies that we
Yep.
use. Like we did a lot of things like that you would want. But there are some agencies that just whether it's the resources or just the leadership or whatever it may be, you may just have to really realize that, hey, look, if I'm going to try and get some work done at, let's say, the VA, might not be as easy, or it might take a little longer, or versus
Right.
NASA, where they kind of
Right.
like they know their stuff. There's usually no headaches. It's more complicated. They got super brilliant people over there working on these things. It's just different. It's just a different
It's
industry, different
different.
ball game.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yep,
I think that's actually really good advice. And
yeah,
that's something I don't think I've ever heard anybody else say out loud, especially that
yeah,
works for the government, is that
yeah.
not all agencies are equal, especially on the
Not at
procurement
all.
side of the house. And it's funny that you brought up NASA because I think I've said this in a previous podcast, but they're the only agency that publishes, or maybe I've seen the DOT do it, but they publish their source selection authority document
Yep.
in it without it being redacted, like in an extreme detail. So,
Yeah.
if you were to recompete something and you pulled up the previous one, you've got their strengths, their weaknesses, how they evaluated everything, signed by the source selection authority. I mean, I
Hmm.
can't think of a better place to start if you're considering going after something than to read that particular document. But not every agency has them.
Yeah, I would say a lot of agencies really rely on debriefs, whether it's a pre-award debrief or
Yeah,
post-award debrief to go through those strengths and weaknesses, which is fine. I mean, that method is fine. Like I'm accustomed to doing that. I don't personally know if I would want to just post an internal like evaluation document, but I'm not opposed to like I get the approach there. It's like this
yeah,
is what we decided and this is why and we feel confident in it. And if you have any issues with it, here you go. Here's what it says. So I can
yeah,
respect that. Yeah.
yeah, cool.
Federal proposals, your voice, less time, exceptional results. Voltron gives you the power of custom language models to reduce proposal development costs by 54% and start to finish submission time by 63%. Voltron is the only AI platform that synthesizes the valuable business development and capture information you obtain to write high-quality compliant proposal content specific to your company in each solicitation. Stop throwing it over the fence. Schedule a demo today at vultron.ai.
I think this question is going to kind of go into what we were just talking about, but when it comes to pet peeves as a contracting officer, what
Yeah.
really kind of like drives you nuts?
Yeah. I'll try to differentiate this response from this last one, but I think that like due diligence really for me is huge. If it's a program manager or someone on my team or private industry and we're having a meeting or discussion and it's very clear that they're either not knowledgeable or aware of what we're discussing or the strategy we're trying to implement or they want to disagree and not provide any proposed solution, that to me just shows that there's no due diligence that's been done. That to me is something that I struggle with. It gives me a headache at times. So that'd be number one. Another pet peeve is when we have inefficient programs or systems that we use in-house to, whether it's doing procurements, whether it's project management tools and softwares, we all have them, companies, federal agencies, when they're either not speaking to each other or there's duplicative effort in those programs or applications, it's really frustrating. And so a lot of what I focus on now in my role is not only like leading a great team of procurement professionals and leading an agency's contracting activities, but really changing some of the processes and systems and doing like change management type work. Because I find that to be pretty rewarding to again, like
Oh yeah.
to be able to create something or to like lead initiative and then to implement a result and see the change and track the change. Like that to me is rewarding. So, you know,
So you just said something that sparked interest for me. Give me like your top 5 tools that you use. I mean, and you don't have to tell me your procurement proprietary, like none of those, but like if you find like Notion or Firefly's AI, or like what tools are you using right now that kind of are delight you as the end user?
I would say right now we're currently in the process of developing some AI tools for us for our team. So we have some performance management folks that we've hired on our staff, and we're developing stuff that suits us specifically. And so like, there's a lot of great AI tools out there and softwares out there, but when it comes to like, how does this fulfill the specific need we have as a government agency and our procurement staff, that's where it kind of lacks. And that's where
Right.
I'm like, yeah, this is a great budgeting tool, or this is like, but that I got a lot of really customized things that I need to accomplish. And so we're working on things that really just automate the way in which we create some of these source selection decision documents that NASA publishes, or a bunch of internal memos that maybe took so much administrative time we never needed to do previously. Whenever we have like determination and finding documents for certain procurements, it automates those. At the local level, we have to submit packages to our city council to get their approval before we can make a final award. Similar, like submitting a CHINFO notification in the federal sector, where Congress looks at it just to make sure they know where the spending is going, like automating a lot of that stuff to make those features better. So that for us is tools that we're developing in-house. Since I joined about 2.5 years ago, that was a big priority for me, is like, what can we create to really automate a lot of this stuff and to create more efficiencies. And so again, that's part of that's half the hat I wear right now, is trying to see those through. And what's interesting is one of the contractors we use for that, they support other federal agencies too. And they've actually told me in direct meetings, like, this is stuff that federal agencies should be implementing for their procurement teams. And so I'm like, I'm happy to be the beta version. I'm happy to be the guinea pig. Like, let's test it out. Like, I want to move, and then we can pick up the pieces later and figure out how to optimize things. And look, if it's some of these things get rolled out into other agencies, that's awesome. At least, I had a small little part in that, but yeah.
And I think that you just mentioned something that I think is going to be a big trend moving forward. I mean, back in the day, agencies didn't talk to each other as much, and they considered their problems really to be very snowflakey. But then I think as more folks kind of move around, they kind of realize that a lot of these problems, the solution can be reused, right? And so I think in bringing the contracting cohort together to kind of move that forward is just going to help us move faster. So one of my previous events I had earlier this year, it was called the Innovation Awards. We actually had a whole panel around interagency, communication and problem solving. And at first I was like, I don't think this panel is going to be very popular, but actually it was like the best panel of the day. So, that's that kind of thinking I think will be really valuable.
Yeah. And I mean, I can say that a lot of what I'm bringing to the table in helping lead some of these initiatives to automate stuff, I was doing at my prior agency in the Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures. Like, we developed application we used from scratch that essentially was a procurement workflow software, all the way from soliciting to award, everything in-house. It was very streamlined. Tracking was easy. Things were automated, moving much quicker. If we had to pull data reports, like, we could do anything and everything. It wasn't a question of where's this project, or what's going on with this, or who's managing this, or when's this ending, or are we going to miss an option exercise here? Or, it's just all those types of things just go out the window. And so some of that, like working on those user acceptance testing teams, really coming up with ideas to help with the development team put that together. I've now taken over here to the District Department of Transportation, and that's a prime example of how things can move from one agency to another. And this contractor we're using may start implementing what we're doing in other agencies. So it's definitely got a butterfly effect, so to speak.
I love that. Yeah. And right now there's so many cool tools out there that are tailored to the procurement process. So Appian, for example, is one case management software. And there's a few others. I know that ServiceNow does some stuff, and there's a bunch of them out there, but it's like everybody's competing to be better, which is actually works in everybody's best interest.
Yeah. I think instead of competing to be better, just compete to be what makes sense for because better is very subjective, and what the District Department of Transportation needs, because we do construction, architectural engineering, other services, IT and supply stuff. We have different layers of approval and functions and things that we need versus some other DOD agency that does completely different. Like so
Yeah.
just be what's right. And that's, I
Right.
think, more important. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That's great. So I think it's funny because each one of our questions kind of like waterfall effect into the next question. And so we're at the right time for me to ask you, what are your personal opinions about the speed of innovation, just in general?
I think so. My personal like thoughts on AI in general are we tend to exaggerate what the outcome will be of technologies that come into society. You know, whether it was the internet in the 90s or like email or those types of things, moving on to AI and all the things in between. Like I think we get excited about stuff, but I don't necessarily think it's going to like take over, like run the show and run the country and take over things.
Right.
I don't think I don't see it putting us at like tremendous risk. Now, should you
Right.
have certain safeguards in place and things like that? Sure. But the reality is like Chat GPT still screws up answers. And
All the time.
there's still things that like, we're not even, in my opinion, close to like creating automated driving vehicles. Like to actually implement it in society, you have to also consider like the human behavior and then also the regulatory bodies and how this all eventually gets implemented. And in my opinion, when you have to go through those like layers, it just ends up becoming a much more diluted version of maybe what we all dreamed it could be. Like it's exciting to have these super high expectations and dreams and what you think could possibly happen, but I kind of taper those down. Like my expectations for that gets tapered down. But in the government sector, like the speed of innovation is certainly not as fast. And we mentioned some of the reasons why. Typically, the larger the agency, the slower things move. Not all agencies are created equal. But with that being said, it is a tremendous focus for agencies to start implementing some of these AI tools to create like AI policy or AI governance or some of those things. And I think that those are very important. And maybe part of the reason why they want to implement a lot of these tools is because they may want to actually have some type of ownership and control over how it's utilized. So that's another way of thinking about it too. So I would say things, in my opinion, always are going to move faster in the private sector. That is the reality of it, and for good reason. But
Right.
yeah, there will be changes. I just think taper the expectation. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there's just like as you were explaining in the beginning of COVID, right? So much panic, not enough disco.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're in that AI hype cycle too. I mean, and COVID, I mean, that made sense for everybody to kind of panic and freak out. But with the whole AI thing, that meme that I saw that was like so much panic, not enough disco is so true. Like, all right, like, look, like it's not Terminator
Yeah.
2 over here.
Yeah. And I mean, that was actually really directly impacting people's lives. So like I can
Yeah.
understand why that is far more critical
Yeah.
versus like a technology. But
Yeah.
yeah, we've gone through these like crypto's been there for 15 years and we
Yep.
thought it's gonna replace the monetary system and it hasn't happened or come close to it yet. Just
Not in
be
this
close.
country anyway.
Yeah. Not in this country, that's for sure. El Salvador, yes. But I look at those things with a kind of a little more scrutiny probably than other people.
Yeah, and it's funny. Sometimes I talk to people that are really heavy on the conspiracy theory side, and I'm like, you must have never worked for the government ever.
Yeah,
So in your role, probably gives you a lot of background to be able to hear these things and look at it from a very clear lens.
I can certainly agree on because I certainly am interested in a lot of conspiracy theories and certainly talk to people that are interested in them. And I'm like, look, I've worked in the government for 16 years. The fact that you think that they could really be organized enough and efficient enough to like do what you're saying is absurd. It's absurd. Like it doesn't even make sense. So let's move on from that conspiracy theory. But this one over here, that might have, a little more legs to it.
Yeah, yeah. Have you tell me that you've never tried to get a Teams meeting to work in a conference room with a bunch of
Yeah.
executives, with a bunch
Yeah.
of like SDSs, like at
Yeah.
one time. You're like, yeah, no, it's so funny. I try to tell people that all the time, and I don't get very far because also I feel like if you've never been in our world, it's hard
Yeah.
to tell people and have people understand, like really, kind of going back to our whole theme here is like why things move the pace that they move, and the different levels of authority and approvals. None of it's by accident. It's all on purpose.
Well, and also whenever these changes come into play or like technological advances come into play, is it actually improving something? We just think, oh, it's a new creation, but what is it actually doing? What value is it adding to society? Like, I mean, we created social media. Is that
Right.
actually something that is a net positive? I don't know. Like, I don't think anyone really knows. Or like smartphones, or like we can exchange information faster. We can certainly do things a little bit quicker, but there are drawbacks to anything too. There's pros and
Right.
cons. So like when it comes to AI, it's the same thing. Like
Right.
whatever we do with it, is it gonna be something that's a net positive or value add to society, or is it just gonna be like a lot of things, it gets controlled by major corporations that control a lot of the stuff that we use today? Like, I don't know. So we'll see.
The jury is still out on that one, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I really want you to take a couple of minutes and tell me about your events business, just because it
Sure.
seemed like such a cool hobby. I don't know if you could call it a hobby,
Yeah.
but it sounded like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
fun thing to do creatively
Yeah.
outside of what you do.
So I never, like, I was always interested in events and like coordinating events. And I always found it to be like interesting. Like when it came to like putting trips together with friends or hosting parties or doing all those types of, like, I just always found it enjoyable. And I never thought in a million years like I would eventually do weddings. Like I want to do like corporate functions, like experiential corporate events, launch events, large corporate conventions, those types of things. And one of my friends at the time just asked me. She just said, "Hey, look, I'm getting married soon, and I can't really afford all the bells and whistles of someone else. And I know you have an interest in this. Is this something you'd be willing to do on like a very bare bones budget?" And I was like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Like I'll give it a go. Like I'll try it out." And then that was the first one, first wedding I ever did. And then yeah, and then you fast forward 5, 6 years, and I was doing super high end luxury 6-figure weddings across the city, all around the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, a couple different destinations, and also getting involved in corporate events. One of the ones I was really bummed about that oh man, I would have loved to have done this one. So the Chinese embassy was going to buy a property in DC, and now currently Jeff Bezos owns it. But go back like several years, and the Chinese embassy was in the process of purchasing the property on Embassy Row area of DC, which is a beautiful neighborhood. And they were going to have a launch event, and it was going to be, this is when Obama was around. So it was going to be all the big names, Obama, Hillary, a bunch of people from Congress, super security controlled. And it was one of the most beautiful facilities that you could create an event with. And I met with the Chinese embassy people. I went through pitches and presentations with them. And eventually they selected my presentation as the one that they wanted. And 3 days later, there was I don't know if you remember when the Chinese hacked into the federal government's
Oh
employee
yeah.
system.
Yeah.
So everything just went dead for several months. And I'm like, what the hell? I would have loved to have done, like, this would have been a crazy, like, career event. Things just sometimes don't pan out that way. And so that got completely nixed. They actually didn't end up owning that property, or maybe they have owned it for like a very, very brief window of time before they had to offload it or were forced to offload it.
Yeah.
And then eventually Jeff Bezos bought that same exact property in DC a couple of years later. So that's something that was just a cool story from my event planning days. But again, it goes back to what I'm able to do in the federal agencies I've worked at. I like creating things from
Yeah.
scratch. I like to see like a vision, how I can implement things, managing different teams or vendors and putting things into place, and then seeing it come to fruition. Like that to me is rewarding, those early stages of development and change.
It's funny that as you were explaining the event planning process, I was like, oh, it's very similar to his actual real job.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's
People think it's wacky. They're like, wow, that's complete 180 from your current, like when you worked in government. And I'm like, yeah, but kind of. I mean, in some ways, yeah, sure. But
in
I don't
some
know.
ways, but
Yeah.
the actual function of it is very similar. Like you said,
Yeah.
aligning vendors, executing on a vision, all
Yeah.
that stuff. It's like the same
Yeah, you're making
Same thing.
pitches and presentations,
Yeah,
you're selling
exactly.
people on an idea and a service. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
all, yeah, yeah.
I love it. Well, I think that's super cool and creative. I myself like to have hobbies outside of what I do. Like right now, I'm writing a cozy mystery novel about some old folks that live in an old folks home because I feel like the older I get, the more I think like the Gen X older millennials are gonna like not retire the same as anybody else. We're gonna like
Yeah,
do something crazy. I don't know what it is, but I just
yeah.
imagine that like I want to bring sexy back for old people. So
No,
that's what
that's
I work
awesome.
on.
I
Yeah,
mean, we're hopefully only gonna continue to live longer, and then you'll have a
right?
bigger audience to do that with. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned before a little bit about networking, and we all
Hmm.
know that in this industry, like most industries, I think it probably is the fire to your engine about how well you can network. How do you approach it personally? Like, are you out and about regularly? And if you are, how do you pick which events you go to?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate that I've been able to do a good amount of like speaking events where I'm either the featured speaker or I'm on like panels and I get to speak to private industry. But in general, I still think it's important to network and go to those functions or conferences or conventions in which you can connect with other, between government and private industry. So I'm part of the reason why like I join these podcasts is to connect with private industry and to answer any other questions like that may be relevant on their minds. I'm relatively active on LinkedIn. It's really just to educate and to share
Right.
ideas that apply to industry and government contracting and things to consider because I just think the government does a poor job of marketing itself. I think most people, it's a struggle to even get like to speak to someone face to face in a government agency. And I just really like to change that. I don't see a need for that. I feel like these are people you do business with. Why would you not want to connect with them? Why would you not want to educate them more on certain things that impact the two of you? Why operate behind like a closed wall? I just don't think that that's beneficial for anybody to get what you need. So, yeah, I think it's highly important to network.
I feel like you could have your own podcast where it would be like from the front lines of procurement, like where
Yeah.
people would just love to ask you
I,
questions and
so it's funny you bring this up because I like in the back of my mind, I've thought about doing like this The Office type of skit with my procurement, like inside the agency kind of like
yes,
show.
yes,
And
yes.
like every episode, like introduce certain people on my team, like, oh, here's this person. It gives it like the little intro and like
Yeah, I think you should
it,
do it. I think that would be so awesome.
but yeah, if I get like a video editor on board to do something like that, maybe. I think it's yeah, I've thought about doing something like that because I think it'd be funny and I think it would just give a better sense of an agency and make it a little more lighthearted. Because I think a lot of
Oh
people
yeah.
view the government as like very stodgy and doesn't really do things that are fun or funny or interesting. It's like, no, there's a lot of like fun people in government agencies. So let's showcase them. Let's market it.
Oh my gosh, that reminds me of Andrea Fletcher over at CMS. She's their open source lead and digital services lead as well. And she was telling me that she does like a type 5 stand-up comedy on AI every week. And I was like, I think I love you.
That's awesome. That's cool. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, the thing, like you said, it's like the perception is
Yeah,
that you are stodgy and all these other things. But the more you get to know people, it's just people working with people. And the
it's
cool thing is
people.
people like to work with people that they like. So
It's
that's,
people. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, people make decisions. Like
Mhm.
ultimately, that's, you know, much as like we'll use these AI tools going forward, people are going to have to be the one to make the decisions or to use critical thinking. And so you've got to be able to influence people somehow to do business. Like that's just the reality of it. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. All right. So I'm getting to my last two questions that I ask everybody. And one day I
Mhm.
want to put together like a whole book, like Tim Ferriss, you know, and his books that he does on like Tribe of Mentors. So
Mhm.
if somebody was watching you from afar, being
Yeah.
inspired by your journey, and I'm sure there's a lot of them out there,
Yeah.
what two pieces of advice would you give folks?
My first piece of advice would be to always find something to consistently be challenged in, whether it's a hobby, whether it's something at your 9 to 5 job, find something that you enjoy the challenge. It's not an unnecessary challenge, it's one that you've sought. And then the other piece of advice would be to not take work too seriously. I think, We live in a society now where people work virtually or hybrid, and sometimes the hours get blended. I think there's a lot of folks that, I would say the millennial generation, like, and maybe older, where work was the identity for that person. Being the first one in and the last one out was a like motto. Whereas now I think Gen Z and younger folks understand like that's not necessarily something that's going to bring me joy. And maybe I don't even work as effectively that way. So definitely enjoy like what you're doing, but don't let it take over your life or take priority over other aspects of your life that you should certainly pay attention to. So those two things, I try to stick to those. Like I think traveling, breaking things up, finding new hobbies are always necessary. I've been trying to learn how to play golf over the last few years. It's the hardest sport in the freaking world.
It's the hardest.
And I played like basketball and baseball growing up, and trying to learn a new sport like in your mid to late 30s is just not the same as when you're a kid. And so it's just like learning a new language. Like if you didn't do it when you were young, it's just going to be really hard to do it when you're older. But it's fun and it's a challenge, and I've certainly gotten a lot better, and I can see those improvements. And so, you know, that to me is part of it. Like if you're not exercising your brain and you're not exercising your will to do something, or the fortitude to do something, then I think that's probably not helpful. Like I think human beings are meant to be challenged and to be stressed a little bit. So always try and find something that can do that.
Yeah, I think somebody could just get married and be stressed too. There's different ways to find stress.
Well, that's the unnecessary stress.
Oh my goodness, we just went on a major tangent. So I loved your advice, thought it was awesome. And then what is your superpower? It's funny because I always ask the question last, and I always have an idea of what I would think you're gonna say. And then the person always says something completely different. So what do you think your superpower is? And how did you know when you found it?
Man, my superpower is being able to, like, I'm a bigger picture thinker, and I think that I can take a lot of voices in a room or a lot of ideas and be able to synthesize them and create like something coherent and an action plan and get it moving to something that I think would be value added for all the people involved or all the stakeholders involved. So I would say just, yeah, thinking big picture, thinking about like what should actually be a priority here and what shouldn't. And I think because I've seen just a lot of people in my life just run up the wrong hill and waste a lot of energy and a lot of stress and not really see the big picture of how this might transpire. And part of that's just things I've gone through in my life. You know, I've experienced decent amount of trauma and loss, so to speak, in my life. I've had to do a lot of things very independently throughout most of my life. And so I think that's helped me become that type of big picture thinker, to really understand like what matters here, what doesn't, what should we focus on, what doesn't, how do you actually communicate it that way so the person doesn't get offended. Those are all like things that I think I do relatively well. And I think it's got me into the position I am because of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and definitely a catalyst, right? Yeah, somebody
Yeah.
that can move
Yeah.
things forward. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. If there's something I really want to accomplish, I will be persistent and wear out everyone else in the room until it actually happens. So yeah, that for sure.
I love it. Well,
Yeah.
catch us next time on GovCom Unfiltered. But for today, thank you so much, Troy. Really appreciate you. And also thank you for your service and the work you do for the American people.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me on your podcast. I think it's been great.
Awesome.
As we draw the curtain on today's chapter of GovCom Unfiltered, I want to thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey through the intricate world of federal contracting. I'm Alexa Choi, and it's been an honor to navigate these stories of courage, innovation, and resilience with you. Until we meet again, keep pushing boundaries, exploring new horizons, and making your mark in the government contracting universe. Farewell for now, but not forever. Stay tuned for more adventures that await in the next episode of GovCom Unfiltered. Safe travels on your path to greatness, and remember, we are all on this journey together.